Hello, I do hope you're well, and a very warm welcome to this brand new series taking a look at some of the key topics of diversity in English language A-level. I'm Ben Wardle, and I'm just trying to get to grips with the new camera angles I've got going on here. So if it looks like I'm staring at the wall or at the ceiling, do not be alarmed. I'm sure we'll get there by the end of this quick fire video. And when I say quick fire, I mean it. The new approach is all about packing a punch, you know me. So we're going to go straight in at the deep end. We have got 15 minutes to take on the topic of social groups. And we're going to be working, I can't speak. What does that say about my social groups? We're going to be taking a look at some key questions that could come up on the exam under the social groups question, if it is on social groups. So the first one, evaluate the idea that a person's language is completely determined by their social group. And of course, the very, very important thing about this question is the completely determined bit. It gives us an opportunity to really go for it with the evaluation, because we'll be saying to what extent your social group does determine the language that you use. That's where you get the marks for the subtlety and the evaluation. So you could say, yes, it is completely determined. So what would my point be? I'd say, studies have shown that your social group shapes your language and your identity. So I'd then bring in, as my support, Penelope Eckert's study into the jocks and burnouts done in the year 2000 at the school in Detroit. And I'd be talking about the fact that she found the non-standard forms in the language of the burnouts, and then the conformity to the grammatical standards, use of standard English by the jocks. So I'd be talking about her study, the fact that she studied them in the school, and these jocks who were those upwardly sociable, mobile people that wanted to do well, wanted to get on. And she found that they were consistently using more standard language, using the more grammatically correct language. So they weren't using the double negation. They were elaborating on what they were saying. Their lexis was being pronounced in the way that conformed to the standard pronunciations. Compared them with the burnouts, who in their social group, they sort of didn't like school. They were quite rebellious. They were engaging in inappropriate activities. You know the score. And their language was then non-standard. So the fact that their social groups were different and that the language they used was different, that would support the idea it's completely determined. The jocks in their group, their language has been determined by that social group, whereas the burnouts, similarly, in their group, the language that they were using was reflecting the fact they belonged to that group that was therefore using the non-standard, which was reflecting their attitudes towards society. And you could support that with Jenny Cheshire's research. So Jenny Cheshire, of course, looked at 13 boys, 12 girls in Reading and their attitudes to drugs and to crime, finding that those who were more the toughest, so those that were engaging in criminal activity and gangs, conformed to the non-standard more than those who were the least toughest, if you like, who were more well behaved, I suppose you could say. So for example, you was with me, the non-standard was, I come down here yesterday and I ain't got no food or nothing. The double negation used there. So the non-standard, the double negation, the incorrect grammar usage is associated therefore with the toughest. They conform to the non-standard, whereas those who showed more, mainstream attitudes to crime and drugs, they use more of the standardised speech. So it shows again that in those children, their language was reflecting the social groups that they belonged to. But we could then bring in a criticism here, okay? So remember our evaluation, we could say these are both studies on young people, on children, in quite artificial situations, that in a school environment, for example. We can't then say that the findings of these studies can be generalised to everybody on the planet in every situation. It just shows us that when these children are in school, they form these groups that then determine their language usage. We could say, no, it's not, therefore, because people change their language depending on the situation. Nicholas Copeland, in his ideas on code switching, really support this, because he said that when we move from public to private discourse, it's the context that becomes key. So we could say, well, whilst you're in public, whilst you're at work, you speak in a certain way, but then in a very different context with different people, you speak in a completely different way. So the idea being that actually our social group doesn't completely determine it. It changes depending on what situation we're in and who we're speaking to. And his study involved a travel agent, and whether that travel agent was speaking to clients, whether those clients were working class, middle class, and then also did a study where they were speaking to their colleagues. So how did the travel agent change the way they spoke depending on who they were speaking to? And so your point in this paragraph could be that social groups do matter, but it's the social group of the people you're talking to as opposed to yours remaining fixed. It's a lot more flexible depending on the situation. For our next paragraph, we could be going back to the argument that yes, it is completely determined. We could say language is the primary means of communication within a group, and so your language is going to reflect your social group. You could draw on Lave and Venga. I think that's how you pronounce it. The Venga. I don't know. They did their research on communities of discourse. So the idea about sharing a domain, a community, and that practice within the community, that means you share the language. Language has a role in shaping and constructing the group. So it's only right that if you belong to that group, you're going to use the language of the group. And that's supported, so it's sort of an evaluation, you could say there's further support for this from Drew and Heritage and their institutional talk, the ideas of goal orientation and lexical asymmetry within a business, so that within that social group, the workplace, there is a very clear influence of your social group on your language because it's used to fulfill the group's objectives, aims, ambitions. It's used in a specific way to aid communication and enhance discussion within the group. So for example, in business, jargon would be used that is only known by the social group, by the business people in the role, in order to enhance communication, in order to develop conversation. And those structures are in place because of the group and the group's hierarchy, for example, and what the group members have in common. Remember, for Lave and Venga, the idea is of a practice. There is something that you all do that unites you, and then that is a framework, if you like. That's a source, a common source of conversation for you within that social group. And then you could also say, this is quite a nice subtle point, you could say, that no, it's not completely determined, because it actually depends on how integrated you are into a social group. So for example, Leslie Milroy's research in Belfast into the open and closed networks. Remember, an open network is where everyone doesn't really know each other that well, whereas closed network is when there are all those dense connections. Everyone's very familiar with one another. And within those closed groups, those closed networks, where it's a lot more personal and it's a lot more intimate, if you like, you know each other well, there is more conformity, she found, to the non-standard. So the idea being that when it is a closer social group, when you're better integrated into the group, your language will be more non-standard, whereas if it is an open network, an open group, so you're not quite integrated in, so it's a brand new group that's formed, for example, or you've joined a new workplace, or everyone's just started college together, that actually you'll show a bit more standard language because of that I don't know what word I'm going for now, for that uncertainty about how people are going to respond to you. So you want to show overt prestige, whereas if you're more familiar with the people, more comfortable in the context, your language is much more likely to be non-standard. You can relax a bit, let your guard down, show that you're one of the group. Yeah. But you could also say here, well, actually, no, Howard Giles' accommodation theory says that when we are with a new group of people, we actually change our language, we converge our language so that it is similar to theirs. So again, the idea that it's about how closely integrated you are to a social group. So it depends. So let me just give you a bit more detail on Milroy. I don't feel I've done that study justice. So they took these people in Belfast, looked at how close they were in their social groups, and gave them a network strength score on a scale of 1 to 5. And they found a correlation between having a high network strength score, so the closer integration density, and the use of vernacular or non-standard forms. So that the non-standard forms correlated to a tight-knit network. So if the social network is stronger, the language is much more likely to be non-standard and shaped by the group. And they studied this by looking at words such as hat, so how you'd say the A sound, and mother, how you'd say the th sound, and whether you were conforming to the standard pronunciation or the non-standard pronunciation. That study actually reminds me of William Labov, which is a key study looking at Sachs, Macy's and Klein's, and the idea of the post-vocalic R, which is a sign of prestige, if you could say, fourth floor, for example, and that being a key judge of your social group, that people at Saks, which was of course the highest prestige store, people who were there would pronounce it fourth floor. Not like that, you know, they're not farmers in the West Country. This was an American study. But you understand what I mean, compared to if they were in Klein's, where that wasn't pronounced. But interestingly, if they were asked to repeat it, if the research was like, what floor is this on? And they're like, sorry, could you say that again? They would then pronounce fourth floor. So maybe that use of language, again, obviously reflecting how it is shaping, social group is shaping your use of language, but also who you're speaking to and what their social group are, and whether you feel comfortable with them, integrated into that group, or that you need to converge. That will shape your use of language. Very, very interesting. So just another question on social groups, just to, you know, make sure we've got all the ideas out there, is evaluate the idea that the social group you belong to has an influence on the language that you use. So you could start with, yes, it does. Studies have shown this is the case. So you could again use Eckert's study, Jocks and Burnout. She's shown that within the group there is an influence on language, whether you're using the standard or the non-standard forms. Jenny Cheshire uses Boys and Girls 13 and 12 in Reading to find that there is conformity to the standard or the non-standard based on the group, whether they use double negation, for example. You could also, of course, use Basil Bernstein. I think that's is his name Basil? Do comment down below if it's not. Please do let me know. I'm sorry, I'm going to say Basil, but I just don't know. It could be Bill. Is it Bill? You do need to check before the exam. So Bernstein, elaborative and restrictive codes. And he was, of course, finding that the working class spoke in restricted codes. Now, I've actually got an example for you here. I thought I need to demonstrate this point. So elaborative is the more middle class. They can expand and explain. They're more expansive in their vocabulary, speaking more depth and detail, for example, whereas the working class would speak with more restricted codes. So, for example, a conversation about David Cameron is my example. It is, Cameron's at it again. That would be your restricted code. You're not giving me much information. Whereas I read in the newspaper that David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, is once again trying to attack the government, as we discussed a few days ago. So you can tell the difference already, the very simplistic and the basic building blocks of language compared with a more expansive, detailed and descriptive narrative. And the idea that children's language is shaped by their social class because it is how they're taught, how they're brought up, and that then affects how they do at school. And of course, an evaluation of this is that it's actually socially sensitive research. To say that your social class will always determine your language is a very strong statement to make, and it is socially sensitive. So if you could get that in this evaluation, I think you'd be doing well. But you could then say, however, this is just one study of one environment at one age. So then again, we could say, no, it doesn't. Our use of language changes depending on the situation. Use Nick Copeland, use Howard Giles's accommodation theory, the idea that in our language we try and converge with the people who we're speaking to, so come closer to them, so change our language so it fits in with the way they're speaking. So you could say, actually, it's not the social group you belong to, it's the social group that you are with at that time. Or we diverge, we try and create a distance from the people that we're with and that we're speaking to, so that when we are speaking, we try and assert ourselves. So they might be like, yeah, all right, mate. Like, good morning. Today's socioeconomic news. So the way you use your speech doesn't necessarily depend on what's your social group, but what theirs is could be equally as important. We could say, yes, it does, because social groups use language as a tool for their communication. Workplace talk drew in heritage, the idea of institutional talk, that there are shared goals, there are then rules for turn taking, so it shows that, say, the workplace social group does determine the language that you use and the way that you speak. Lev and Venga, the discourse community of practice, domain, etc. You can say, no, it doesn't. It depends on the strength of the group, whether you are in a high density social group or a low density, whether it's an open network or a closed network. And I do think that's quite a nice subtle point to be bringing in. We could also talk, of course, about gender. If you thought, oh, I'm good at gender, you could bring that in, because that is a social group. So, for example, Zimmerman and West, the fact that in their conversations that they studied, the interruptions were always overwhelmingly by the males. You could say it shows us fixed differences between the women and the men. And of course, Deborah Cameron, the difference model, status versus support, advice versus understanding, information versus intimacy. There are clear differences that are determined by your social group of gender that is important. But of course, to counter that, you could then say it is not always fixed. It changes depending on the situation. For example, the courtroom study by Obar and Atkins, that found it was actually about your role in the courtroom, whether you were a judge or a witness, that shaped the language you use, not necessarily a social group such as your social class or your age or your gender. So very interesting ideas there on social groups, a little whirlwind look. So just to remind you of some examples, because remember, this is my big thing. You need those examples in your answers as well as your evaluation, of course. So the post-vocalic R, studied by Labov in the New York department store study of flaw, the R sound at the end, and it was a sign of prestige. If you used it, this would suggest you were of a higher class. So I'm just doing my hair now. I'm like, oh, a bit curly. So it's, as the class of the store increased, the use of the R sound increased. So sax saw the most use of floor, and then Kleins at the bottom saw the least usage. And then also the middle classes, so Macy's, used hypercorrection, so they'd correct themselves very quickly, perhaps again seeking to make a better impression and to upwardly boost your social class. And then the use of terms like you was with me, it ain't got no food or nothing. So the use of the non-standard in groups such as the burnouts or the toughest girls and boys studied by Cheshire, for example, showing how that was affecting the language that they use. And then the elaborative, restrictive codes. So plenty of people from Bernstein, whatever his first name is, to Cheshire, to Milroy, to Lev and Venga, plenty of theory going on. My top tip is always have you very clear question-related starting sentence for every paragraph. Get some theory in there, get some examples in there, get some evaluation in there, and get a link back to the question in there. So that's it for social groups. Thank you very much for joining me. It has been a pleasure, as always. I'll be back very soon with more for English language, so please make sure you do join me then. I'm Ben Wardle. You can follow me on Instagram, benwardle_, or on Twitter @benwardleuk. Thank you very much. Have a good day. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.